May I have your attention, please? The opening ceremony for the 13th International Greenhouse Gas Conference will begin shortly at 1 p.m. If you are still standing outside in the halls, please come inside and take your seats. Also, as a courtesy to your fellow participants, please silence all portable electronic devices. Today's conference will be broadcast live on YouTube in English. For your convenience, simultaneous interpretation is provided throughout the entire duration of this conference. For Korean, please tune into Channel 1. For English, Channel 2. And in accordance with the government's guidelines on the prevention of the spread of COVID-19, please be reminded to keep your masks on throughout the entire duration of this conference. Now, I am aware that the luncheon is still being served. Because we are running a little bit behind schedule, the Secretariat has decided to commence the official opening ceremony at 1 p.m. while the luncheon is still being carried out. So please take note of that. I will see you back here at 1 p.m. The opening ceremony for the 13th International Greenhouse Gas Conference will begin at 1 p.m. Please come inside and take your seats. Once again, as a courtesy to your fellow participants, please silence all portable electronic devices. Once again, today's conference will be broadcast live on YouTube, and for your convenience, simultaneous interpretation will be provided throughout the entire duration of this conference. There has been a change to the channel numbers, So for Korean, please tune into channel number 5, and for English, channel number 6. Once again, channel number 5 Korean and channel number 6 for English. Once again, please be reminded to keep your masks on throughout the entire duration of this conference and make ample use of the hand sanitizers provided on the table in front of you. Hello and welcome to the 13th International Greenhouse Gas Conference. This is hosted by the Greenhouse Gas Inventory and Research Center of the Korean Ministry of Environment. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is 미소랑, and it's an absolute honor and delight to be serving as your MC for this conference. 안녕하십니까? 미소랑입니다. 반갑습니다. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to extend my sincerest gratitude to all officials and members for taking precious time out of your busy schedules to both attend today's conference and for extending valuable help in the organization of this conference. In particular, I'd like to extend a sincerest gratitude to Mr. Seo Heung-won, President of the Greenhouse Gas Inventory and Research Center, as well as all experts, for your continuous endeavors to reduce greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. And furthermore, I would like to extend my gratitude to those joining us via YouTube for taking time to join us all over the world. Now, the theme for the 13th International Greenhouse Gas Conference, as you are well aware, is key policy instruments toward carbon neutrality. We look forward to a lively and in-depth discussion on the road to the 2050 carbon neutrality target, examining various topics and case studies, including the EU emissions trading system, the climate border adjustment mechanism, ESG, and climate-related disclosure. Now, before we proceed, I'd like to invite onto the stage President Seo Heung-won onto the stage for the opening remarks. Please welcome him with a big round of applause. President Seo Heung-won from the Greenhouse Gas Inventory and Research Center will deliver the opening remarks for the official opening ceremony of the 13th Greenhouse Gas Conference. Please once again greet him with a big round of applause.
내외 기빈 여러분 반갑습니다. 온실가스 종합정보센터 서웅원입니다. 이 무덥고 습한 날씨에도 불구하고 이렇게 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 깊은 감사의 인사를 드립니다. 참 올해는 코로나19로 인해서 그동안에 한 2년간 온라인으로 진행했던 국제온실가스 컨퍼런스를 3년 만에 다시 대면으로 전환한 자리이기 때문에 그 어느 때보다도 참석자 여러분들을 반갑게 환영합니다. 이 바쁘신 일정에도 귀한 시간을 내어 환영사를 전해주신 저희 한하진 환경부 장관님을 비롯하여 2050년 탄소중립 달성 방안에 대한 경험과 지혜를 나누기 위해서 참석해 주신 발표자, 토론자분들께 깊은 감사를 드립니다. 잠깐 좀 벗고 시작하겠습니다. 그동안 온실가스 종합정보센터는 온실가스 배출 인벤토리 작성과 감축 목표 수립과 이행 점검 지원, 그리고 온실가스 감축을 위한 국제 협력에 최선의 노력을 기울여 왔습니다. 올해로 개최 13주년을 맞는 국제 온실가스 컨퍼런스도 이러한 노력의 일환이라고 봅니다. 최근 들어 기후 위기의 심각성은 전 세계 곳곳에서 확인되고 있고 점차 더 강해지고 있는 것 같습니다. 유럽에서는 사상 최악의 폭염과 가뭄으로, 미국에서는 초대형 산불이, 그리고 중국에서는 폭우와 홍수로 인해서 많은 사상자와 천문학적 피해가 발생하고 있습니다. 그러나 이거는 몇 가지의 예시일 뿐이고 많은 개도국들에서도 더 큰 피해로 고통을 받고 있는 것으로 알고 있습니다. 기후변화에 따른 이상 날씨 현상은 우리 대한민국도 예외는 아닙니다. 여기 계신 분들이 최근에 많이 경험하셨을 것입니다만 서울의 폭우 80년 만에 80년 만의 현상입니다. 그리고 폭염과 가뭄도 갈수록 심해지고 있습니다. 그래서 국제사회는 이러한 기후변화에 대응하고자 지난 2015년에 파리 협정을 맺었고 국가별 상황에 맞는 NDC를 수립하고 있으며 지난해 영국에서 개최된 제26차 기후변화 당사국 총회에서는 세계 각국이 석탄 발전을 단계적으로 감축하는 데 합의하는 등 지구기온 상승을 1.5도 이내로 유지하기 위해서 대응을 가속화하고 있습니다. 비록 최근에 경제 및 에너지 위기 등으로 국제사회의 대응 기조가 다소 주춤한다는 우려도 있습니다. 그렇지만 탄소 중립이라는 것은 더 이상 거스를 수 없는 시대의 흐름이고 패러다임이 변하는 한 과정이라고 봅니다. 우리나라도 이러한 흐름에 동참하고 기후위기에 대한 보다 적극적으로 대응하기 위해서 지난해 8월과 올 3월 탄소중립 기본법령을 제정하면서 2030년 감축 목표를 2018년 대비 40%로 명시하고 국가와 지역 단위까지 기본계획을 수립해 점검하도록 하는 등 탄소중립 이행체계를 확립했으며 현재 부문별로 구체적이고 명확한 이행 방안을 준비 중에 있습니다. 이러한 상황에서 오늘 국내외 기후 전문가들이 모여서 탄소중립 달성을 위한 주요 정책수단이라는 주제로 최신 국제 동향과 정책적 시사점을 논의하는 것은 매우 시의적절하고 의미 있다고 봅니다. 이번 제13차 국제온실가스컨퍼런스에서는 유럽연합의 배출권 거래제 및 탄소 중립을 위한 그 역할, 탄소 노출 위험을 완화하는 방안, 그리고 ESG 기후 공시의 발전 등에 대한 국제 동향을 소개하고 이러한 정책이 주는 시사점과 대응 방안을 모색하고자 합니다. 오늘 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 다시 한번 감사를 드립니다. 그리고 2050년 탄소 중립 달성이라는 범국가적인 그리고 범세계적인 목표 달성을 위해서 가는 이 길고도 먼 대장정에 필요한 통찰과 식견을 나눌 수 있는 기회가 되기를 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, President Seo, for your opening remarks. That was Mr. Seo Heung-won, President of the host organization, the Greenhouse Gas Inventory and Research Center of the Korean Ministry of Environment. Continuing on, Minister Han Hwa-jin of Korea's Ministry of Environment will deliver the welcoming remarks. We ask for your attention to the screen.
안녕하십니까. 대한민국 환경부 장관 한화진입니다. 올해로 13번째를 맞이하는 국제온실가스 컨퍼런스 개최를 축하드립니다. 오늘 컨퍼런스를 준비해 주신 서흥원 온실가스종합정보센터장님과 관계자 여러분, 바쁘신 중에도 발표와 토론을 맡아주신 국내외 전문가분들, 그리고 참석하신 모든 분께 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 얼마 전 기후변화에 관한 정부 간 협의체, 즉 IPCC가 발표한 제6차 평가보고서에 따르면 우리가 현재 속도로 온실가스를 배출할 경우 2040년 이내에 지구의 평균 기온이 산업화 이전보다 섭씨 1.5도 높아질 가능성이 매우 크다고 경고했습니다. 이는 IPCC가 2018년 1.5도씨 특별보고서에서 예상한 2050년보다 10년이나 빨라진 것입니다. 기후변화는 우리 눈앞에 닥친 실체적 위기입니다. 세계 각국은 기후위기에 대응하기 위해 탄소 중립 사회로의 전환을 본격 추진하고 있습니다. 유럽연합의 탄소 국경 조정제도, 미국의 기후정보공시 의무화 제도 등 글로벌 탈탄소화 흐름 속에서 기후위기 대응이 국가 경제의 경쟁력을 좌우하게 된 것입니다. 우리 정부도 이러한 국제적인 움직임에 발맞춰 2050년 탄소 중립을 선언하고 2030년 국가 온실가스 감축 목표를 수립했습니다. 탄소 중립은 과학적 분석에 기반한 실천이 무엇보다 중요합니다. 이에 정부는 과학기술과 혁신에 기반해 실현 가능한 부문별 감축 목표 달성 방안을 마련할 계획입니다. 이를 달성하기 위해 온실가스 감축의 주요 정책 수단인 배출권 거래 제도를 고도화해서 유상할당 방식을 확대하고 탄소를 잘 줄이는 기업이 시장에서 유리하도록 방식을 개선해 나갈 것입니다. 또한 우리 기업의 기후 대응 노력이 투자 가치로 인정받을 수 있도록 환경정보 공시제도를 세계 기준에 맞추고 저탄소 친환경 경제 활동에 금융 투자가 활발히 이루어지도록 금융권과도 협력해 나갈 계획입니다. 이러한 배경에서 각국의 온실가스 감축 정책에 대한 이해와 개선 방향을 논의하는 오늘의 이 자리는 매우 의미가 크다고 생각합니다. 다시 한번 참석해 주신 모든 분께 감사 인사를 전하며 오늘 컨퍼런스에서 논의된 정책 제안과 아이디어는 충분히 검토해서 정책에 반영하도록 하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much, Minister Han. Please be reminded that the interpretation device channels are as follows: number 5 for Korean and number 6 for English. All right, we will adjourn here to take some commemorative photographs to mark this special occasion and also to take a break. For this group photograph, I'd like to invite the following people up onto the stage. Seo Heung-won, President of the Greenhouse Gas Inventory and Research Center, Hong Jong-ho, Professor of Seoul National University, Alastair Ritchie, Director of Asia Society Policy Institute, Jonathan Woodland, Head of British Embassy Seoul, Mark Watson, Country Managing Partner, ERM Korea, Im Dae-ung, CEO of BNZ Partners, Park Ji-young, Deputy Director of Ministry of Environment of Korea, and Im So-young, Research Fellow of Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade. Now, if your name has been called, please come up to the stage and we will take some group photographs. For everyone else, please enjoy your break for the next 9 or 10 minutes. Coffee and refreshments are provided outside in the hall, so please enjoy that. And also, please be reminded, unless you are actively drinking or eating, to keep your masks on to prevent the spread of COVID-19. I will see you back here in 10 minutes. May I have your attention, please? The main session for the 13th International Greenhouse Gas Conference will begin in just a few minutes, so please come inside the hall and return to your seats. Once everyone is seated, we will begin with the main session. We will now begin with the main session for the 13th International Greenhouse Gas Conference. The first speaker is Mr. Alistair Ritchie, Director of Asia Society Policy Institute. Everyone, please welcome him onto the stage with a big round of applause. Mr. Alistair Ritchie is an international expert in greenhouse gas emissions trading systems, and his presentation today is titled The EU ETS and its Role in Achieving Carbon Neutrality in the EU.
안녕하세요. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a great honor to be invited to speak at the 13th International Greenhouse Gas Conference. Thank you very much to GIR for the invitation to speak. And in my presentation this afternoon, I will be sharing the latest developments of the EU emissions trading system. This is important because these developments can provide some good lessons for Korea and for other jurisdictions that have either already implemented or are planning to implement this type of policy. As you're probably familiar, the EU has adopted a 55% GHG reduction target by 2030 to be on the pathway to net zero, the Fit for 55 package. And in line with the Fit for 55 package, many EU policies have been revised, including the EU ETS. So in my presentation, I'll be firstly talking about the impacts so far of this policy. Then I'll be highlighting some of the key revisions as a result of the Fit for 55 package. And then finally, I will present some lessons for other countries that are implementing emissions trading systems. Firstly, the key message is that the EU ETS is effective in driving GHG emission reductions cost effectively. There's been about 35% reduction in emissions between 2005 and 2019. Most interestingly, in 2019, the Market Stability Reserve was introduced to sort out some long-term problems of over-allocation and oversupply of allowances in the market. And once that had been implemented, it really did transform the policy, and it transformed the emissions reductions. So in 2019, there was a 9% reduction just in 1 year alone. And then in 2020, there was a 13% reduction. So in this chart, you can see the red line is the verified emissions with a sharper drop in the last few years, and the other lines represent the ETS cap. The carbon prices reflect what I mentioned before about the solution to the surplus and excess allocation in the EU ETS once it was finally solved. And once the EU had adopted its 2050 net zero target, everybody knew that the ETS cap by 2030 would be much more ambitious. So the carbon prices jumped up to hit $100 per ton towards the end of last year because of the expectation of the limited supply in the market. And the key message is that the high carbon prices are really able to drive large-scale decarbonization options like green hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization and storage, and other technologies. So I guess the EU ETS works in two ways. In one way, it works through the carbon price. The carbon price is an incentive for companies to reduce their GHG emissions through their operational and their investment decisions. The other way in which the ETS works, and I'll be coming to this later, is through support for investment. So the ETS generates a huge amount of revenue through auction recycling, and it also generates revenue to support innovation fund. So there's two important mechanisms by which the EU ETS can drive GHG reductions. The power sector is the kind of success story so far of EU ETS. It has really resulted in quite significant reductions in power sector emissions. So what this slide is showing is an example of the merit order of how power stations are introduced into the grid. This is a German company with information from 2018 and 2019. So effectively, with the way in which the electricity market works in the EU, the carbon price is influencing dispatch decisions, and On the left, in the dark brown and grey, you've got lignite and coal, which are used very widely because they're cheap in Germany. But when the carbon price increased from 2018 to 2019, the lignite and coal was pushed to the right-hand side of the chart, and gas, which is yellow, came to the left-hand side. That meant that the merit order enabled low-carbon power generation technologies to be prioritized. And there was, I think, a 40 million ton reduction just in 1 year alone in Germany because of the ETS. Clearly, energy prices change, and this picture now is different, but the message is that merit order needs to be impacted by the carbon price to drive power sector reductions. And I'll come on to that in terms of lessons for Korea and other countries. The industrial sector story is a bit different. I guess the big improvements and the big reductions are going to happen after 2030. But before 2030, there are going to be some significant developments. And the way in which the ETS has a long-term policy certainty, the way in which people have confidence in the policy and the carbon price to 2030, combined with the availability of funds through Innovation Fund, auction revenue, is a big motivator for industry to decarbonize. So, for example, in the steel industry, by 2030, it's estimated that 30% of EU primary steel production will be decarbonized using green hydrogen. And one example is Salzgitter Steel in Germany. By 2025, they plan to introduce the first green hydrogen electric arc furnace to replace their blast furnace. That will reduce their emissions by 30%. By 2030, they will do another change to get a 50% reduction. By 2035, they will have 95% reduction in GHG emissions through the transition from blast furnace to DRI with EAF. In the chemical sector, there's a perhaps more complex mixture of abatement technologies, like cracker furnace redesign, electrification of crackers, hydrogen furnaces, biomass, CCS, etc. One example is BASF, which is planning by next year to have electrically heated steam cracker, and its Antwerp site is planning to be net zero by 2030. And then in the cement industry, there is a huge amount of investment in carbon capture and utilization, with a lot of demonstration projects going on, and big switches to alternative fuels, reduction in clinker share, etc. And there's a lot of information available on the EU Industry Association websites of best practice case studies. So I really encourage you to have a look at CEFIC, Sembureau, Eurofair websites, and so on. I guess the key element of the EU ETS is the cap, and the 2030 ambition of 55% reduction in GHG versus 1990 is cascades down in the EU target setting methodology into a burden for the ETS sectors and then the non-ETS sectors. So what this means is that for ETS sectors, through the modeling of cost-effective compliance, they get 61% reduction in GHG by 2030 from 2005 reference period. Non-ETS sectors get 40% reduction. This is reflecting more cost-effective abatement in power and industry sectors. So the EU ETS is a key instrument for the EU to achieve their goal of GHG reduction, and it plays a central role in the Fit for 55 package. And I think that's also true in Korea, how the KETS can play this central role in providing assurance. And in fact, in Korea, the coverage of the KETS is much bigger than the EU EU ETS covers about 40% of GHG, whereas in Korea it's over 70%. But this chart is quite significant because it shows the linear reduction factor. And to convert from the old phase 4 target, which was 43% reduction by 2030, that is now 61% reduction. So the linear reduction factor, every year the cap drops by, will now drop by 4.2% every year from 2024, whereas the previous linear reduction factor was 2.2%. And this chart actually shows, if you look at 2020 on the left and 2030 on the right, there's approximately 50% reduction in GHG emissions over this time period. It was really interesting to think about how the EU were able to implement this tighter cap, and surprisingly, they didn't have much resistance from industry, and this is primarily through transparent decision-making, a systematic methodology, an open economic model that everybody knew the assumptions and the data, and effective stakeholder engagement. And I think it's also important to combine this with carbon leakage mitigation measures, which are there to protect industry from competitive disadvantage, so CBAM and free allocation, etc., which I'll come on to. In terms of the free allocation is not major changes in this. Primarily, free allocation, as you're probably familiar, is based on benchmarks that are based on average of top 10% performance, which is already very ambitious. These are updated now based on latest data. There's different time periods for that. The carbon leakage factor is broadly similar, so factor of 1.0 if you're trade intense and emissions intense, 0.3 if you're not. There is some better targeting, so the reduction in the benchmarks can be more ambitious now. And then there's also broadening of the scope to ensure no disadvantage for green hydrogen, for example, or low-carbon steel. There's some conditionality, so if a company is not implementing energy efficiency measures, then it will have a 25% reduction in free allocation. I guess the big thing is, and I guess the following presentation is CBAM, so I'm not going to talk much about that, but in terms of free allocation for sectors covered by the CBAM, then their free allocation will drop by 10 percentage points from 2026 down to 0 by 2035. And then that free allocation that they would have got is going to be sent to the Innovation Fund to provide funds for investment. There's also a phase out of free allocation for aviation. In terms of the scope, there are some significant changes because the EU realizes that their reductions have been most effective for ETS sectors, and they've been least effective for non-ETS sectors. So there's been a drive to bring more sectors into the ETS. So maritime transport is now in. They've been doing MRV for maritime for a while, so I guess it was relatively straightforward. Rather than free allocation, there's a phase-in period of allowance surrendering for maritime. This is basically ships traveling within the EU, and 50% of emissions of voyages from EU to non-EU countries. Significantly, buildings and transport are two sectors where emissions have actually gone up in the EU. So they've decided, or they're planning to have a new ETS for buildings and transport. You may be familiar in Germany, there's an ETS for heating and transport fuels. This is a similar kind of upstream ETS that regulates energy suppliers. Also, California has an upstream ETS for transport fuel suppliers. So this will be seeking to decarbonize these sectors more ambitiously. There'll be full auctioning because entities can pass through their costs. There'll also be a social climate fund, so 25% of the revenue will be used to support vulnerable households or other vulnerable groups. I guess in the case of Korea, there's already transport and buildings included in the scope through the simple definition of inclusion based on 125,000 tons a year if you're an entity, or 25,000 tons a year if you're an installation, regardless of the sector. So in some ways, the Korean ETS is a good system. It's very simple, and it doesn't exclude any sector like the EU does. That's partly because of the indirect emissions allocation and how electricity is included in the KETS. But there may be some other opportunities for the KETS to expand its scope, which I'll come to later. The next point is on auction revenue recycling. So, as you're probably familiar, in the EU, all of the power sector is auctioned allowances, because they can pass through their carbon cost to electricity prices, and they really don't worry at all about the carbon cost. So 57% of allowances are auctioned, and what's happened is that as the carbon price has gone up, the amount of revenue has really gone through the roof. So in the EU, since auction revenue was collected, there's now been $118 billion of revenue collected through auction revenue. That's a significant amount. That's more than double the amount of money the Korean government is putting into the Green New Deal, for example. This money is being used by member states for multiple purposes, primarily climate. In the future, they'll have to use all of it for climate and energy, as well as social purposes. But most of the revenue, in fact, half of the revenue for the EU has come through the last 2 years, because it's linked to this jump in the carbon price. Once they've got the system working, with the MSR, they solved the problem of the surplus of allowances. The carbon price jumped up, and then this huge amount of money is critical to support low-carbon transformation. And if you look at this chart on the right, this is from the ICAP Emissions Trading Worldwide ICAP Status Report 2022. Highly recommend this reference. It gives so much useful information. There's a chart here, maybe a bit difficult to see, but it shows the EU has generated $118 billion of auction revenue. California has collected $18 billion. Korea has collected less than $1 billion. That's because in the KETS, auctioning is only up to 10%, and the carbon price is relatively low. So these are the big opportunities to support. If you think about how industry in Europe is really accelerating with its investment plans for decarbonization, it's partly because they can get money through the EU ETS. The Innovation Fund is the other mechanism. So this is, I guess it's relatively well known, the Innovation Fund. It's under continual improvement. They've increased the amount of the size of the fund. So it's 450 to 650 million. It's gone up to 650 million EU allowances. So it's tens of billions of euros. So this fund is awarded through project applications, primarily through helping technology become commercialized, to bring to the market decarbonization solutions. So, as I mentioned, the allowances that would have been freely allocated to CBAM sectors are now going to be auctioned, and the auction revenue is going to go to the Innovation Fund. Interestingly, one of the significant improvements to the Innovation Fund is the use of carbon contracts for difference methodology, which reduces the risks to investors in projects where normally you think the carbon price is quite volatile, it's going up and down all the time, but carbon contracts for difference provide some security on the carbon price for projects, and it brings down the real cost of projects significantly. In fact, in Germany, they've got a separate carbon contracts for difference policy just for industrial innovation. And then the last slide here is really lessons for an ETS, because why are we talking about the EU ETS so much? What does it mean to any other jurisdiction? EU is not the same as Korea. EU, the problems and solutions are different, but there are some important lessons. I think the first one is to develop the ETS cap in line with the national GHG reduction target. So we know Korea has the 40% reduction NDC by 2030. The KETS already has a methodology to align the KETS cap to the national target. So that methodology should be applied appropriately to ensure that the KETS cap is consistent with the tighter 2030 NDC. That will have a significant difference on the carbon price. Ensure a broad sectoral coverage. So KETS already has a broad coverage. It might reduce once the carbon cost is passed through to electricity prices and indirect emissions may no longer need to be allocated. The scope might reduce, but the question is, should transport fuels be included? For example, should there be an upstream fuel distribution inclusion, for example? And then should the thresholds be reduced for certain sectors like buildings? Introduce full auctioning. So we know that this year the environmental merit order is due to be implemented in Korea so that the carbon cost can be included in the variable operating cost of power stations, which will be a great improvement and a great breakthrough. And also that the carbon costs can be passed through to retail electricity prices, although there is a limit on that, the extent to which that can happen. But once that can happen, full auctioning to the power sector can happen. There might be concerns about high electricity prices, but the revenue can be used to protect vulnerable industry and vulnerable households. There should be a fund that can be used in a very targeted way to support the transition to net zero from key sectors that need this finance, steel industry, chemical industry, etc. There can be lessons from the Innovation Fund, from the EU, lessons from Germany, lessons from the US with their loan program, for example. There should be ambitious benchmarks. We know that there's fairly generous allocation based on weighted average benchmarks, but should that be more ambitious? Should it be a certain percentage below that, like in California, where it's 10% below the average? EU is top 10%. There should be rule-based market stability measures. There's some very effective market stability measures in California based on controlling the price, with price ceilings and price thresholds. And then this provides certainty to the market. The benefit of this is it makes the job of MOE and much easier. They don't have to intervene manually. The market is more predictable, just like in the EU and just like in California. And then liquidity is also another issue. I think this is gradually improving, but there needs to be perhaps more third-party participants and more, through regulating and protecting against market abuse, then this can also happen. I think the market needs to work properly with a tight cap, with high level of auctioning, generating huge amounts of revenue to drive the investment needed for carbon neutrality. So I think there's some good lessons here from the EU, and Korea's made great progress with the KETS. I guess it's now just refining certain design choices around the KETS to turn it into a really powerful tool to support decarbonisation in Korea. But also this is relevant just as much to Indonesia, in India, China, Vietnam, Thailand. There's lots of other countries developing their similar policies. So thank you very much for listening, and that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Alistair Ritchie, once again for that wonderful presentation. We will continue on with our next presentation. And for that, I'd like to invite onto the podium Mr. Jonathan Woodland, Head of Climate Diplomacy at the British Embassy Seoul, onto the podium. So please greet him with a warm round of applause. Mr. Jonathan Woodland began his career with the UK Ministry of Justice back in 2009 and has held roles in both the Ministry of Defence and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. His presentation today is on mitigating the risk of carbon leakage. Over to you.
Thank you very much. So my sincere appreciation to President Hong-Gun So of the Greenhouse Gas Inventory and Research Center of Korea for his invitation for me to speak here today. The first step in responding to the climate crisis is understanding the scale of the challenge and the scientific basis to inform our response. So thank you to President So and his team for the critical role they play in this regard. I'm delighted to be here today to address the nature of the current debate on how countries should respond to mitigate the risk of carbon leakage. In this regard, the UK is working hard to build international consensus for, firstly, ambitious action on mitigating carbon emissions, and secondly, the use of policies such as carbon pricing to ensure that incentives in the private sector are aligned with domestic and international efforts to decarbonise. I must stress at the outset that the UK decision-making in how best to mitigate the risk of carbon leakage through policy or through a package of future policies is firmly in the development stage. We are currently reviewing options and taking on board evidence through public consultation. So whilst there are no definitive answers I can provide today on how the UK's final approach will look, I'll aim to provide some insight into how the UK is approaching the issue of carbon leakage. Various estimates indicate that 20 to 30% of global CO2 emissions are connected to international trade in one form or another. Many developed countries are net importers of trade-embodied emissions, a feature of the gradual shift of manufacturing to rapidly industrializing countries and the associated transition to a service-dominated economy in many high-income countries. So it's worth stating up front that as the UK looks at the carbon leakage challenge, we define this as a displacement driven, as per the slide says, by specific factors such as carbon pricing and climate regulation, rather than alternative determinants of displacement, for example, access to labour, capital, raw materials, which sit outside this broad definition. As things stand, the UK appraises that there is limited evidence of carbon leakage occurring in the UK right now, but that we expect the risk to increase significantly this decade for reasons I'll go on to discuss. Whilst we are still deciding our approach on specific policy actions to take to limit carbon leakage, we are set on our approach to driving ambitious global action on mitigation. The UK is leading global calls to achieve emission reduction trajectories of 45% cuts by 2030 on a 2010 baseline, a level of cuts which the IPCC advises is required to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Ahead of COP26 last year, the UK worked with all parties to strengthen ambition. And by making COP26 the most inclusive COP ever, we brought in key non-state actors, using the opportunity presented by Glasgow to accelerate engagement on issues such as in industrial decarbonisation. In the aftermath of COP26, somewhere in the region of 90% of the global economy is covered by net zero commitments. Many of the biggest emitters, including the G7, Korea, and in recent weeks Australia, have significantly enhanced their NDCs. Yet as the UNFCCC have recognised, globally NDCs are at present insufficiently ambitious to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as the chart in the slide shows, there is a worrying dissonance between NDCs and the actual policies in key sectors such as power, transport, industry, to actually reduce the emissions. At the optimistic end of the spectrum, we're looking at scenarios where we can limit warming to 1.5, but there is real concern that we may be facing an off-ramp in excess of 2 degrees Celsius, unless emitters everywhere, but especially the biggest developed emitters, take greater action. Warming in excess of 2 degrees Celsius is, as we know, potentially catastrophic. And that's why the Glasgow Climate Pact asked all countries, including Korea, to review and improve their NDC ambition in 2022, strengthening sectoral transition plans, for example in transport, power or industry, if, as in many cases, it's actually impossible to increase the top-line NDC ambition. And the UK is following the same trajectory at the moment. We're looking at our own NDC and deciding how we can improve and strengthen, and if that's possible in this year of 2022. So it is the firm contention of the UK that international problems are addressed by international solutions, and climate is the ultimate international problem. That's why our starting point is that we want sufficient numbers of countries to take action which mitigates greenhouse gas emissions at a similar rate in given sectors, thereby reducing carbon leakage risk for all. So the first step, and one that we've encouraged through multiple channels, but not least our G7 presidency in 2021, is to encourage our trading partners to ambitiously mitigate emissions in coordination with one another, whilst taking into account common but differentiated responsibilities. To date, the UK has made solid progress in meeting its own mitigation targets. Our commitment to reduce domestic emissions by 68% by 2030 on a 1990 baseline is broadly on track. As of 2021, we've achieved a 47% reduction in emissions. The UK's Climate Change Committee, which reports annually to Parliament and holds the government to account in the delivery of its emission reduction commitments, has highlighted a number of praiseworthy areas of delivery. So this includes the rollout of renewable energy, enabled by a combination of cost reductions over the last decade and an effective policy framework. The UK can now celebrate 50 gigawatts of renewable energy connected to the grid, up from 9 gigawatts in 2010, with approximately a further 45 gigawatts either under construction or where planning has been submitted or approved. On the back of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, our energy security strategy has shifted to an even more ambitious low-carbon posture, with even greater ambition on renewable rollout by 2030, combined with massive investment planned in civil nuclear, with an aim of 24 gigawatts by 2050, which is 3 times more than at present, and a doubling of hydrogen production to 10 gigawatts by 2030. These are some of the highlights of the recent strategy. The Climate Change Committee also acknowledges that the UK's positive take-up of electric cars, efforts to reduce the intensity of energy in the industrial sector, and efforts to increase energy efficiency of the steel sector have been effective, as have measures to reduce emissions connected to meat consumption. But there is a huge amount more to be done in order to achieve our NDC. In the UK, were we to use 2021 as a baseline year, we still need to make approximately 40% emissions reductions by 2030 in order to achieve the NDC. We aim to achieve this with support and advice of stakeholders from across the economy. Business is crucial, and the advice of academics and other stakeholders is incredibly valuable in this regard. As we look at the tax chart, we can see kind of an evaluation based on current policy and implementation plans. So overall, we need to follow the line of reductions at the bottom of the chart, but green indicates an estimation of where the Climate Change Committee believes we have credible plans to achieve emissions reductions. Yellow indicates plans where there are some risks, and orange where there are significant risks. Red denotes areas where there are just insufficient plans in place. So whilst forward-looking plans to roll out clean energy and zero-emission vehicles hold promise, the Climate Change Committee have significant concern in the government's plans to improve energy efficiency, to deploy electric heat pumps in homes, to make progress in low-carbon farming, to advance woodland restoration, and to roll out industrial CCS project pipelines. The government is now in the process of responding to the Climate Change Committee's recommendations and to strengthening delivery plans. I add this UK story for context Firstly, because I was asked to by the organisers, but secondly, because it helpfully frames how the UK may choose to respond to the risk of carbon leakage. Countries globally are, to a greater or lesser extent, now thankfully moving on a path to deep carbonisation, and we hope, as science demands, mid-century net zero. But much of this shift to net zero is happening at an uneven pace. The UK needs to maintain its ambitious trajectory whilst ensuring that our industries are not unduly penalised for investing in the transition at a pace which science tells us is required to limit warming to 1.5. Having the right policy measures in place is critical to achieving this, because we can expect the risk of carbon leakage to increase in the mid-2020s, as industries not only adjust their business models to meet net zero, but as the carbon price remains on a broadly upward trajectory. In a UK context, the leakage risk increases further as the decade progresses, and the UK implements the policies to deliver its most ambitious sixth carbon budget for 2033 to 37. During that 4-year period, will be critical to deliver our overall 78% emission reduction targets, which we've already set for 2035. Industry is already advising the UK government that the risk of carbon leakage is leading to investment hesitancy right now, and we therefore need to be prepared to ensure net zero remains on track. The UK is not alone, I think it's fair to say, in this effort or within this concern, and that's why internationally the response to carbon leakage is occupying increasing profile and bandwidth in multilateral settings. In this critical decade for action, calls from a growing number of countries are for an inclusive multilateral response to carbon leakage. So I have listed in a slide a number of the key components of what are emerging as key aspects of a strengthened international climate architecture. Many of these are critically at the point where trade and climate converge, and that's why they're increasingly becoming important multilateral issues. I'm sure in addition to those listed that I may have missed off a number of other really important and valuable platforms. The UK is at the stage of engaging with all of these proposals put forward, but we do not have positions necessarily yet on all of them. This is a dynamic field where much thinking and much work still needs to be done. So this is just but what I think is probably helpful is now if I provide a summary of the overarching aims of each platforms to give you a sense of how the issue of carbon leakage is debated and being discussed. So the OECD's Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches is exploring how climate policies compare on emissions reductions to improve global understanding of the comparability of policy stringency and to improve global dialogue and decision-making. The Climate Club is a German proposal covering a range of aspects, but emissions measurement, carbon pricing, carbon leakage, R&D, and sector decarbonisation are really important themes. The G7 is engaged on the benefits of carbon pricing, the measurement of embodied emissions, and assessing carbon price equivalence. The links between climate and trade, the industrial decarbonisation agenda, all continue to be promoted through dialogue in the G7 on all these issues. Carbon pricing is also being discussed in the G20 to ensure an approach which is being built which works for the broadest range of countries, those developed and developing economies. The IMF's International Carbon Price Floor proposes a single common carbon price internationally, differentiated by income level, whilst the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions Group is working to advance the WTO's Trade and Environment Work Plan. Elsewhere, we have the Breakthrough Agenda process, the G7 Industrial Decarbonisation Agenda, the Industrial Decarbonisation Initiative under the Clean Energy Ministerial, all broadly aiming to create market demand for low-carbon industrial materials such as steel, cement, work on the harmonisation of embodied emissions, reporting and standard setting. Combined, they aim to drive a greater demand for green industrial goods through setting shared targets for low-carbon public procurement. whilst recognising that different countries will take different approaches to climate regulation and economy-wide decarbonisation, we are, through the initiatives set out here, seeing a broad shift to a stronger multilateral effort to mitigate the risk of climate leakage. That brings me to say some final words on the UK and the next steps we're taking in this critical decade. As we transition to net zero, the UK recognises the importance of addressing the risk of carbon leakage to ensure that our ambitious policy on decarbonisation is not undermined. As I've suggested already, the best way to do this would be for either countries to firstly decarbonise at a broadly commensurate pace, or secondly, for all countries to move together in pricing and regulating emissions. This type of international solution is possible, but can take time to develop. So we need to consider domestic options, and these have to be targeted and proportionate for certain sectors. At present, 3 allowances under the UK emissions trading scheme are our main form of carbon leakage mitigation. In the UK and beyond, one of the criticisms of free allocations is that they have dampened incentives to ramp up modernisation and decarbonisation in industry. So to meet the challenge of 2050 net zero, we must align the UK ETS with a net zero trajectory, and the future free allocation policy is being considered as part of this. As things stand, we're working on a net zero consistent ETS at the moment, and that's a project which is ongoing and will hopefully produce some results soon. We are also considering alternative mechanisms, and yes, this does include a carbon border adjustment mechanism, highlighted, as per the slide, in the UK's net zero strategy, which was announced in 2021. A consultation on the UK approach to a CBAM is underway as we speak, to ensure we secure the feedback of stakeholders, both domestically and internationally. Alongside free allowances and CBAMs, consideration is also being given to policies which would grow the market for low-emission industrial products, such as product standards, labelling, and procurement measures, and these will be considered as part of a much wider package. But let me be clear, this does not mean that a UK CBAM will necessarily be implemented in the future. Any policy or combination of policies in this space will balance a range of priorities for the UK, both domestically and internationally, and decisions are yet to be taken. So to conclude, in what has been a fairly swift review of quite a large amount of ground, I hope I've been able to set the scene for how and why the UK is looking to mitigate carbon leakage. What I think is worth taking away from this discussion is the understanding that debate on how to mitigate carbon leakage is emerging as a priority for a number of countries. This will continue to be a significant factor in multilateral fora for some time to come. The drive to avert leakage is driven by a desire from countries such as the UK to achieve net zero and to ensure the right incentives are in place for businesses seeking to decarbonise. All the time ensuring that domestic emissions reductions aren't simply shifted elsewhere and replaced by an increase in consumption emissions, none of which will help us achieve Paris targets. It is very much in the interests of all countries to deepen engagement in this space. As disciplines converge, in this case climate and trade policy, there will inevitably be different approaches and understandings on the issue. Today, I've presented much of this through the lens of how we tackle the climate crisis. But the UK absolutely wishes to focus on a coordinated international response to address carbon leakage in order to avoid new barriers to trade or disputes. I look forward to following up with counterparts here and elsewhere wishing to discuss this matter further in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was Mr. Jonathan Woodland, Head of Climate Diplomacy from the British Embassy Seoul. Please give him another big round of applause. And that brings us to the third and final presentation for today. The title of that one will be The Evolution of Sustainability Disclosure. For this, please welcome onto the stage Mr. Mark Watson. Mr. Watson is the country managing partner of ERM Korea, and he has over 35 years of experience in the fields of ESG, sustainability, and environment management. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon. 안녕하세요. Investors, governments, and the wider community expect expect businesses and industry to be able to understand, to be able to measure, and to be able to disclose their ESG, sustainability, and climate-related performances. That has been a journey over many, many years, and I would like to share some of my insights, I guess, and learnings about that journey and what it perhaps tells us about the future. I'd like to thank the organisers for the opportunity to speak here today. Very briefly about ERM, we're the world's largest pure-play sustainability consultancy. We have about 7,500 people across the world in 170 offices in 40 countries. About the Sustainability Institute, it's our own forum on which we aim to drive the businesses and business performance through better information. And I'd like to acknowledge our Sustainability Institute for some of the contributions to my presentation today. Very quickly, I wish to give a quick overview, I guess, of where we've come from over many years, where we are in terms of disclosure today, and perhaps a brief look into the future and what that might mean. Bear with me, I guess I'm going to use ESG, sustainability, and climate-related issues interchangeably. I know, no, they're not, but for the ease of presentation, perhaps bear with me on that one. So we have been on quite a journey, and it started probably well before this slide indicates, but we've gone through a range of eras, I guess, starting with the regulatory era, where information about, I guess, impacts that businesses and industry had on the environment was regulated. Clean air in particular was one of the first to get regulated in many places around the world. And from regulation we moved to policy, to guidance, and that was both on an independent jurisdiction level, but also more broadly at regional and global levels. But that wasn't enough, and we saw increasing activism in a range of areas, but particularly, and I guess most notably in regard to climate, with local NGOs and international organisations being vocal about the need for change and the need for improvement in our performance as a business, as an industry, and as a community. I think what we've seen over recent years, though, is a move from those having influence outside of the organisations, whether that be government or activists, to moves kind of within the organisations where stakeholders, shareholders, investors have had a say in how companies should perform. And that performance needs to be measured. I guess I'll come back to this quite a few times. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so we've seen us, I guess, move towards an era where sustainability, ESG issues, climate-related matters have been integrated into business performance as part of the overall governance and operations of a business, and that has provided ownership and provides, I think, some hope to improvement rather than a responsive approach, which had certainly been in the past. And we're now looking towards, I guess, transformation. So that drive from just not doing things better, but perhaps doing things differently. And I think one of the areas that we're particularly seeing that is in the transformation in many of the large multinational oil companies around the world who, for many years, were in the extraction of oil and gas and its transport, and far more their portfolio of operations is including renewables. And I think this is a great thing. So we have been on quite a journey, and there's become an evolution of this alphabet soup almost of guidelines and frameworks and standards and disclosures. It probably started again way before this slide indicates, but some of the early pieces of work by the OECD in capturing environment in along with economic requirements, the fundamental, I guess, definition of what sustainability was back in the mid-80s with the Brundtland Report, and then this evolution of guidances on how we capture things, how we measure things, how we should record our performance. There have been organisations, both private and government-related, that have set out to instruct, coach, and encourage industry to be more transparent, to be more consistent. But that hasn't been coordinated. And what has happened has been this evolution of standards and guidance that makes life fairly difficult for businesses to react to respond to, and to perform against. A couple of things, I guess, in particular I wanted to kind of draw attention to on this slide, and one is the TCFD, so the Task Force for Financial Disclosure, climate-related financial disclosure. Formed in 2015, their benchmark reports released in 2017 kind of set the most broadly, I believe, accepted framework within which we can operate. And things that have followed have largely based themselves around that. We've seen most recently in March and April of this year 3 quite important pieces of policy and documentation released, and I'll discuss those in a minute, but they relate to the IFRS, the SEC, and the International Standards Board. But very quickly on TCFD, so Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, as I said, established in 2017. The aim really was to help to provide some guidance to industry really and to companies, to collect and to utilise information in a way that would enable more informed use of that capital in a more appropriate and sustainable way. There were 4 thematic themes, as you can see on the slide there, and there were 11 climate-related recommendations, which, whilst there has been some evolution even within TCFD since then, have largely stood the test of the last few years, and as I said, form the basis of what much has followed. But the whole sustainability, particularly ESG ecosystem, is really quite complicated. So it's made up of a range of organisations that do different things. So those in the top right corner there that kind of set some frameworks for how data should be collected and managed, how performance should take past some objectives, some targets, etc. The bottom right, those organisations that actively request information and collect and collate that information. In the middle there, those groups like Bloomberg and MSCI that more passively collect data, trawl the internet, look at reports that are tabled at stock exchanges around the world and disclosures that companies make themselves, and collect and collate and compare. And then those that actually purchase data and end up with rankings and ratings, so the top 100 this and the best 50 that's. So it's some very different approaches and some very different ways of really trying to achieve the same end, and that is to help businesses be more transparent and therefore more accountable, and to help investors to make more wise and informed decisions, and in so doing help to transform business and industry into a better future. With all this collation of different sets of standards and guidelines, frameworks, etc., it's very difficult to operate. We advise companies all around the world, and I guess, as we said, most of the Fortune 500s, or at least over half of them. And it's challenging, right, to know where to go and what to do. As we see here, that the International Organization of Securities Commission called last year for a move towards harmonization. I'm not sure that's exactly happening, but we are getting better. So, as I said, in the last, I guess in April and March March and April of this year, there were three quite important pieces of work released for comment. The last of which, I guess, closed for comment only this week. One by the US Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the European Financial and Reporting Advisory Group, EFRAG, and the International Finance Reporting Standards, so IFRS. So one with a US focus, one with an EU focus, and one with an international focus of setting some benchmark standards. I might just bring it down so I can see the screen a little bit. As you can see, the first one released by the SEC requires that all companies that file with the SEC report their climate-related emissions. Within the EU, there was guidance issued on a broad range of sustainability-related disclosures. And at the international standards level, that included very detailed climate-related standards. All of them roughly and broadly are based on TCFD and are consistent with it. SEC uses its own approach for disclosure and its own approach to some metrics and targets. ISSB, in terms of the standards, presents additional requirements over and above TCFD, and the ESRS is perhaps the most prescriptive, and whilst it aligns with TCFD guidelines, it significantly adds some more detail. So in the context of creating more harmonisation, there is some consistency, but we're still kind of creating different sets of guidelines and goals. In regards to emissions disclosures, all of them follow the TCFD guidelines. Thankfully, we use the same terminology and protocols for how we refer to Scope 1, 2, 3 and the methodologies associated with them. All call for mandatory reporting of Scopes 1 and 2, and Scope 3 gets a different bit of treatment depending on the size of the organisation and emissions and commitments made by companies, particularly in the US. In Korea, I think the important thing, and I guess from the earlier two presentations as well, what we've seen is what happens internationally is very important. We are, climate is the single, unique and common issue facing every nation. And so our approach to managing impacts on our climate and as a result of impacts to us as a result of climate change allows us to look beyond our own borders and to learn from other jurisdictions, and I think that's important. So here in Korea, I guess there's the very similar ecosystem and arrangement of requirements. So there's some drivers, there's some requirements for companies to implement data collection and disclosure. They might come from the stock exchange, if they're a member of PRI, etc. There's some targets, and we've largely followed international standards, science-based targets, and the RE100 related to energy uses. There's some requirements for us to assess in a similar and consistent way. The KCSG requirements for those who are listed on the stock exchange, and some international standards as well. So requirements to do some things, requirements to set some targets, requirements to assess, and then the requirements to disclose. We would have seen recently that the Korean Stock Exchange has committed to releasing its own guidance on disclosure. So yet another set of rules in that ecosystem. But a commitment is there to base it both on TCSD, but also on the 3 documents that I have just spoken about. So we'll see, and that's due for release in 2025. Disclosure requirements are increasing here and will be mandatory depending on the size of the organisation in terms of capital size of the organisation. And we can see here from the slide that the timetable over which that is proposed to occur for those that are listed on COPC. I think what's interesting and what's valuable here is Korea, like in many other jurisdictions, the alignment of normal financial reporting, governance reporting, along with sustainability and ESG reporting in a more common framework, not a separate issue, not something else for a company to deal with and to think about, but to be integrated into their day-to-day business and therefore their reporting to their shareholders and to the market in general. And I think that's quite important. I've moved through my speech fairly quickly, so I've come to my last slide, and I guess there's a few takeaways that I wanted to share in regard to this journey that as a community, as an industry, that we've been on. Sustainability, ESG, carbon emissions, and disclosures are related to them. Will continue to evolve. How we do it, the data we collect, when we collect it, the level of detail we collect it, the methods we use, how we communicate that with our shareholders, our stakeholders, and the wider community will continue to evolve, and that's a good thing, right? And we'll get better at this. However, the benchmarks and the systems within which we do that, we have a way to go to have a simple and consistent framework within jurisdictions and around the world. And I think the opportunity, say for example for Korea through the stock exchange to set some guidance that builds on something else but has a Korean context, I think is an opportunity to get some alignment but some local focus. And it will be different, everybody's will be different. But at least if we have some consistency of terminology, then that allows the application of different technologies and etc. to allow us to be more consistent. It's unclear whether methods used in one jurisdiction to record will be accepted by others. So I think there's a way to go with that. As we said earlier, I think that there's some very good lessons to be learnt. Many countries are on a different phase of their journey and closely watching what is happening, participating wherever possible in the debate is very important for any nation, including South Korea. So the trends that happen have implications for how things will unfold here. Things will get tougher, so there will be an expansion, I think, of where we are. The type of data that is collected will get requirements to be more detailed, more explicit, more reliable, open to audit, and certainly I think we will see the requirements, the demands from the community at large and shareholders to actually count those Scope 3 emissions, so not your direct or indirect, but those that are associated with your supply chain, which is a very challenging area. those demands will be greater, so the challenges for organisations will continue. So we should take note of what's happening elsewhere, and whilst we're developing our own our own form of data management and collection and collation, we should take note of TCFD, because I think it does provide the broadest and most valuable framework, and I think we'll end up utilising that here for the disclosure. I guess, as I kind of said early on in the piece, disclosure is very important. It's important because it keeps companies honest. It enables us to assess our own performance and to have to stand up at a stock exchange or in front of our shareholders and declare our performance, and that drives improved performance, which is what we all want to see. And the data that backs that up is critical, because if you can't measure, you can't manage. So with that, I would like to say thank you, 감사합니다, and I look forward to the rest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mark Watson, for sharing with us your insights on ESG and climate-related disclosure. That concludes the presentation session of the policy efforts being carried out by various governments, organizations, and institutions in order to achieve carbon neutrality. On behalf of all participants here today, I'd like to extend our deepest gratitude to all three presenters and the organizations and the institutions, governments that you represent for your continuous efforts. So everyone, please join me in extending another big round of applause to all three speakers, Mr. Alistair Ritchie, Mr. Jonathan Woodland, and Mr. Mark Watson. Okay, we will now move on to the panel discussion to explore further ways forward to achieving carbon neutrality by the year 2050. I will now invite the panel up to the stage. Discussants, as I call your name, please come up forward to the stage, and everyone else, please greet them with a big round of applause. Please welcome Mr. Alistair Ritchie, Mr. Jonathan Woodland, Mr. Mark Watson, Ms. Park Ji-young, Mr. Im Dae-ung, Ms. Im So-young. So all panelists, please come up forward to the stage. And I'd like to invite the moderator, Professor Hong Jong-ho of the Graduate School of Environmental Studies at the Seoul National University. Please welcome them with a big round of applause. Okay, Professor, you have the floor.
예, 세 분의 발표를 들었고요. 이제 토론 시간입니다. 한 50여 분 정도의 시간이 있기 때문에 바로 진행을 하겠습니다. 뭐 아시는 대로 오늘 나와 있는 주제는 사실 기후 위기에 대응하는 차원에서도 그렇고 또 향후 우리나라, 우리 한국 경제에 미칠 파급력도 굉장히 큰 그러한 사안들이기 때문에 아마 여기 오신 분들 굉장히 관심이 많으실 것으로 생각을 합니다. 그래서 그런 아주 구체적이고 실질적인 이야기들이 토론 중에 나올 수 있을 것이라 기대를 합니다. 세 분의 토론을 저희 모셨습니다. 먼저 BNG 파트너스의 임대웅 대표님 10분간 토론해 주시기 바랍니다.
안녕하세요. 방금 소개받은 비욘드 넷제로 BNG 파트너스 임대웅입니다. 저희 회사에서는 그 KETS 3기 계획을 짰고요. 특히 이제 아까 말씀하셨던 벤치마크 스터디를 해서 국가 할당 계획도 잡아봤습니다. 그리고 이제 ETS 제도를 짜다 보니까 이 ETS 제도 간의 어떤 차이를 가지고 탄소 국경 조정 제도가 작동되잖아요. 그래서 탄소 국경 조정 제도 EU 제도도 저희가 좀 살펴보기도 했는데 먼저 여기 이제 알레스테어하고 조나단 이렇게 질문이 하나 있습니다. EU CBAM을 보니까 집행위하고 유럽 의회하고 의견이 갈리는 것 같아요. 특히 더 많은 제품을 넣어야 된다 또는 스코프 2를 넘어서 뭐 3 비슷하게 가야 된다라는 의회 의견이 있는데 아마도 이게 스코프 2가 잘 안 받아들여지는 게 EU ETS 제도의 어떤 한계 때문이 아닌지 좀 여쭤보고 싶어요. 예를 들어서 KETS에서는 스코프 1, 2를 당연히 기본으로 가져가는데 EU에서는 스코프 1만 가져가잖아요. 그래서 요거 좀 간단히 좀 질문을 드리고 싶고요. 사실 제가 오늘 이렇게 나온 거는 기후 공시 때문에 나왔습니다. 그래서 기후 공시 관련해서 제가 간단히 발표 자료를 좀 준비했는데요. 이게 화면에 띄어질려나요? 예, 기후 공시는 세 가지가 있다고 생각을 합니다. TCFT부터 얘기를 아까 이제 우리 마크께서 해주셔서 얘기를 드리려고 하는데 혹시 이게 슬라이드가 나오나요? 뒤에? 저만 보이는군요. 예, 일단 이 TCFT 공시가 되게 이제 글로벌하게 핫합니다. 근데 이게 어디서 왔냐면 G20의 금융안정성위원회 FSB예요. 그러다 보니 우리나라에서도 이 TCFT를 바라볼 때 이게 단순 공시로만 보는 게 아니라 금융감독으로 봅니다. 그래서 작년 말에 금융감독원에서 기후리스크 관리 지침서가 나왔어요. TCFT를 기반으로 합니다. 그래서 한국에서는 이게 작년 12월 8일 날 나오면서 이제 자발적 가이드라인으로 나왔다가 올해 연말이 되면 의무 가이드로 바뀝니다. TCFT에 따라서 기후 관련된 거버넌스, 전략, 리스크 관리, 또 공시를 해야 한다로 이제 연말에 금융 감독 체계가 바뀌는 것 말씀을 드리고 싶고요. 시간 관계상 지금 현재 금융 감독 당국들이 전 세계적으로 이제 기후 리스크를 금융기관의 건전성에 넣기 시작합니다. 이거는 이제 은행들 입장에서는 바젤 은행감독위원회 BCBS가 있죠. 그리고 보험에서는 IAIS, 그리고 아까 잠깐 나왔는 IOSCO 자본시장을 규제하는 감독 당국에서도 TCFT를 기반으로 기후 리스크 관리를 합니다. 근데 이거는 작년 올해 저희가 이제 정부 부처랑 만약에 TCFT 방식으로 재무 분석을 기후 시나리오에 대해서 한다면 어떻게 될까를 분석을 해본 겁니다. 여기 보시면 크게 4개 회사가 있고요. 섹터는 발전, 시멘트, 철강, 정유입니다. 그리고 이 표가 복잡하긴 한데 가장 이제 끝단을 보시면 탄소 규제 준수 비용이 시가총액의 몇 %까지 갈까라는 분석을 했고요. 여기 시커멓게 표시되어 있는 게 100%를 넘는 부분입니다. 100%가 넘는다는 얘기는 탄소 규제 준수 비용이 시총을 다 날렸다, 기업 가치가 없다라는 뜻이기도 하죠. 그래서 실제로 이런 것들이 중요하다라는 게 한국에서도 이제 입증이 됐는데 이런 정보가 우리나라에 없는 것 같아요. 그러다 보니 이게 이제 비재무 정보인 ESG와 기후 정보는 다르다. 이건 재무 정보다라는 것이죠. 아까 말씀하셨던 그 IFRS 재단에서 ISSB 국제 지속 가능성 표준 위원회가 만들어졌고 S1, S2 가이드가 나왔는데 한국에서도 KSSB를 만들었습니다. 근데 여기서 좀 강조를 하고 싶은 거는 KSSB의 주류 분들은 회계 교수님들이세요. 근데 환경 분야 분들하고 접점이 별로 없으세요. 이게 지금 우리나라의 좀 문제인 것 같고요. 그래서 회계와 환경의 접점을 좀 만들어야 되겠다라는 인사이트를 좀 생각을 해봤습니다. 그리고 마지막 세 번째 기후 공시에서 중요한 거는 이 텍소노미입니다. 사실 우리나라의 텍소노미 하면 맨날 뭐 원전이냐, 뭐 LNG냐 이런 얘기만 나오는데요. 이 텍소노미라는 거는 사실 핵심이 금융이 돈을 낼 수 있는 녹색의 정의를 내리는 거 아닙니까? 그러면서 녹색 금융을 텍소노미에 따라서 하도록 만드는 게 가장 중요한 기능입니다. 물론 그린워싱 방지도 있지만요. 우리나라 금융그룹들 보게 되면 신한금융그룹인가 2030년까지 30조를 텍소노미에 따라 투자한다고 해요. KB, 하나, 우리 뭐 이런 데들은 50조를 쏜다고 합니다. 엄청난 돈이죠. 그래서 굉장히 기대가 많이 되는데 EU 텍소노미처럼 우리나라에서도 K 텍소노미가 있습니다. 지난 한 2년에 걸쳐서 많은 의견 수렴을 해서 이제 저희 회사에서 참여해서 만들었는데요. 이 텍소노미를 보게 되면 공시가 또 있습니다. 이게 텍소노미가 분명히 녹색에 대한 기술적 기준, 법적 기준이면서도 기업이다. 그러면 녹색 매출, 녹색 캐펙스, 녹색 오펙스의 비중을 공시하게 돼 있고, 은행이다. 그럼 녹색 여신 비중, 자산운용사다. 그러면 녹색 AUM 비중, 또 투자회사는 녹색 자산 비중, 이런 것들 공시하게 돼 있어요. 이런 게 나오기 시작하면 굉장히 많은 변화가 예상이 된다라는 겁니다. K 텍소노미가 이제 작년에 나왔는데 여기에서 이제 보시는 것처럼 한 69개 녹색 경제 활동이 있고, 앞으로 기대하는 바는 뭐냐면 기업들이 텍소노미에 따른 녹색 어떤 재무 성과들을 공시하도록 하는 것, 또 금융기관들이 녹색 금융 성과를 공시하도록 하는 걸 기대합니다. 올해 시범 사업을 하고 있고 내년까지는 이제 프로젝트 중심으로 가겠지만 또 2024년 정도부터는 기업 전체의 기업 공시로 간다. 그렇게 되면 이제 녹색 여신, 녹색 투자 펀드 이런 것까지 텍소노미가 연결이 되겠다. 이런 말씀을 좀 드리고 싶습니다. 여기서 좀 궁금한 것을 좀 우리 마크 대표님께 드리고 싶은데요. 영국 같은 경우 TCFD 공시를 올해 2022년 의무화를 시켰습니다. 그래서 상장기업 100%는 올해 TCFD 공시를 해야 되고요. 은행 같은 경우 94%의 은행들이 올해까지 TCFD 공시를 해요. 그리고 보험사 같은 경우 한 89%, 또 퇴직연금 한 75%는 무조건 TCFD 공시를 하게 하거든요. 그것도 올해까지. 물론 G7이 TCFD 공시를 의무화시키긴 했는데 영국에서는 상당한 혼란이 있을 것으로 예상이 됩니다. 그래서 이 지금 상황이 어떤지, 영국 정부는 이걸 어떻게 매니징을 하고 있는지 궁금합니다. 이상으로 말씀을 마치겠습니다.
네, 임대웅 대표님은 현재 빠르게 진행되고 있는 이 기후 관련 정보 공시 제도에 대해서 상세하게 설명을 해주셨습니다. So before we forget, there was a question, two questions each to Mr. Ritchie and Mr. Watson. So can you briefly comment on that before we forget now? Did you understand the question of him? The question, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I can't really, on the TCFD, that's not my expertise, so I'll leave that to others to comment on. In terms of the CBAM question that you asked, I'll make a few comments, but other colleagues might want to add and provide some additional comments. I mean, you mentioned about whether the UK will be subject to the same CBAM regulations as Korea. I guess the EU CBAM applies to people that export goods to the EU from outside the EU. So Korea and the EU and the UK would be treated in the same way. The actual impact will be very different though, because it depends on the carbon price in the UK and the carbon price in Korea. So the actual CBAM obligation will be a function of the difference between the EU carbon price and the carbon price in the relevant jurisdiction. But I would like to say that the draft CBAM legislation is very high level. There's a lot of detail still to be determined about the detailed implementation and the MRV and all there's a long list of things still to be worked through, but I'll leave other colleagues to elaborate.
Mr. Ritchie, I think his question, as far as I understand, is there is a difference in understanding of the nature of EU ETS between the Commission and the European Parliament in regard to
whether you should include scope 1 or to scope 2. Because right now, his understanding is the EU ETS only covers scope 1. So that's why when it went to Parliament, they were thinking about including scope 2 as well. So what is your understanding between the difference between the understanding of Commission and the Parliament when they try to introduce CBAM? I think that's the question he's thinking. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, again, I know that the EU scope 1 is, I guess, direct emissions are the first thing to be covered. Indirect emissions are on the list to be included. So there's recognition within the EU that indirect emissions need to be included, but the timescale for doing that is not clear. And I'm not up to speed with the negotiations between European Parliament and the EU, but I think it's recognized that in Asia, indirect emissions allocation is very important, given the power market is completely different, and that if indirect emissions are not treated properly, there'll be big issues with CBAM. So I think this is definitely a key issue, but I'm not sure that I can comment on the specific detail.
Okay. Mr. Watson?
Okay, thank you. I guess before I answer a specific question on the United Kingdom, I should say I'm Australian, and I've lived and worked my whole life in Asia and Pacific. But however, I guess it's important to recognise that the UK actually did bring in mandatory non-financial disclosures in the mid-2000s, say around 2006. So the requirements for TCFD making mandatory TCFD disclosures is probably nothing new in the UK. Obviously, mandatory disclosure has been probably further developed throughout the EU in many countries. One thing, I guess, while I probably have the microphone, I think it's important to recognise that mandatory disclosure is not going to be an easy journey for us, for anybody, as an industry. Compelling people to do things, regardless of what it is difficult, and some of the concepts and measurements around ESG-related issues, because they aren't exact as some of the things we measure, like financial performance, etc., makes it challenging. It's interesting that we note even in the last couple of days, the reaction, I guess, driven by the SEC, the SEC documentation and the impending, I guess, requirements for US companies to mandatory disclose a whole range of information, and the reaction has been quite interesting. There were, I understand, 20 attorney generals from 20 different states in the US petitioned BlackRock, one of the largest asset management firms in the world, petitioned them in regard to they believed the negative financial impact that ESG management was having on pensioners and shareholders. So the road towards mandatory disclosure is I think the right one, but it's a challenging one, and it's going to be rocky.
Mr. Woodland, do you have anything to add? I mean, it's up to you.
Just very briefly, and it really just builds on Alistair's point about the CBAM, and I will say up front, Alistair knows a lot more about this than I do. He's very much the expert. But just going back to the point about the impact for the UK. So in short, the UK is no longer a member of the EU. So yes, we will be impacted. We're looking at the impacts of the EU CBAM for trade and considering how best we can support UK businesses. We're also considering how the EU CBAM impacts on our own approach to carbon leakage. All these things are ultimately linked. I think as Alistair also said, the UK has, but we already have ambitious carbon pricing through our own ETS carbon price support mechanism. We expect the EU CBAM to take account of this during implementation. But as with all similar type mechanisms, there are always compliance costs. There are always burdens for businesses. So these are all considerations we're taking into account as more and more information is known about the EU CBAM. So there's not a dissimilar problem set for the UK to Korea, although we do, for reasons Alistair has talked about, coming at it from a slightly different perspective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. 예, 다음으로 산업연구원의 임소영 박사님 10분간 토론해 주시겠습니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 방금 소개받은 산업연구원에서 온 임소영입니다. 저는 오늘 그 토론에 대해서 두 번째 발표문이었던 탄소 누출과 그리고 탄소 국경 조정 제도에 대해서 좀 토론을 요청을 받았고요. 그래서 좀 두 번째 발표문에 대해서 좀 더 집중적으로 의견을 말씀드리고 그리고 질문 드리도록 하겠습니다. 일단 그 한국은 그 급속한 경제 발전, 경제 성장 시기였던 그 1990년대 이후부터 전력 소비와 그리고 온실가스 배출 모두 지속적으로 증가해 왔습니다. 아까 발표 자료에도 나왔지만 사실 영국이나 미국 그리고 독일과 같은 주요 선진국들은 1990년대 이후에 온실가스 배출량이 오히려 감소하는 그런 추세를 보여주고 있는데 안타깝게도 한국은 아직은 90년 대비 2021년에 약 전력 소비는 450% 증가를 했고요. 그리고 온실가스 배출은 약 150% 증가했습니다. 그렇지만 한 가지 이제 희망적인 것은 이런 한국의 온실가스 배출이 여전히 증가하는 양상을 보이고는 있지만 최근 그 증가세가 감소하고 있고요. 그리고 에너지 믹스에서도 주요 화석 연료인 그 석유 비중이 굉장히 압도적으로 높았습니다. 그런데 이 석유 비중이 굉장히 감소해 왔고 그리고 재생에너지 비중도 아직 크지는 않지만 조금씩 증가하는 그런 추세를 보여주고 있습니다. 그런데 탄소 누출이라는 것을 진단하고자 할 때는 이런 한 국가의 뭐 온실가스 배출량이라던가 그 에너지 소비가 어떠한가 이런 것만 가지고 저희가 진단할 수는 없고 각 상대 국가와의 어떤 그 교역 관계라든가 수출입 구조가 어떤지 그리고 주요 수출 품목이라든가 수입 품목의 온실가스 배출량 내재되어 있는 온실가스 배출이 어떤지 이런 부분들을 같이 확인을 해야 탄소 누출을 진단할 수 있을 텐데요. 그래서 만약에 지금 탄소 국경 조정 제도를 이제 제안해온 EU와 우리나라와의 어떤 교역 관계가 어떤지 또는 이제 우리나라가 주요 생산 기지를 많이 이전해 왔던 개도국과 우리나라와의 그런 관계가 어떤지에 따라서 탄소 누출이 어디서 발생했는지 이런 부분을 확인할 필요가 있다고 봅니다. 한국은 철강이나 화학과 같은 중화공업 중심의 제조업 중심으로 산업 구조가 이루어져 있고 그리고 수출 위주의 산업 정책을 통해서 단기간에 경제 성장을 이룰 수 있었습니다. 이렇게 이러한 산업 구조를 통해서 단기간에 경제 성장을 이루었다라는 점은 굉장히 좋았지만 반면에 그 탄소 누출의 이슈에 대해서는 좀 더 그 민감한 상황이 될 수 있었습니다. 실제로 한국 제조업 중에서 가장 많은 온실가스를 배출하고 있는 산업이 철강 산업이고요. 그리고 두 번째가 화학 산업인데 전체 제조업 온실가스 배출 중에서 약 절반을 철강이 차지하고 있고 그리고 약 3분의 1을 화학 산업이 차지하고 있습니다. 그런데 이 철강 산업은 EU의 그 CBAM의 초안에서 밝힌 5대 그 대상 품목이 되겠고요. 품목 중에 하나이고 그리고 화학 산업 같은 경우에는 이 초안에는 포함되지 않았지만 유럽 의회가 수정안을 제안한 그 품목 중에 그 수정안에서의 품목 중 하나로 포함되어 있습니다. 그렇기 때문에 향후에 추가적으로 또 포함될 가능성이 있고요. 그래서 게다가 이 철강과 화학은 우리나라가 대EU 수출에 대해서도 굉장히 수출 비중이 높은 그런 품목이 되겠습니다. 그렇기 때문에 이 EU가 CBAM을 시행하는 과정에서 우리나라 그 산업 중에서 가장 영향이 많을 그 업종으로 산업으로 철강과 그리고 화학 산업이 되지 않을까 그렇게 예상할 수 있는데요. 그런데 이제 그 정도의 차이는 있겠지만 우리나라에서 지금 시행하고 있는 그런 제도들이라던가 그리고 ETS 이런 부분들을 어떻게 상호 호환해서 정량적으로 그 측정할 수 있을지, 그래서 이제 EU 제도나 규제 대비 우리나라 제도가 어떤지 이런 부분에 대해서 또 측정해서 같이 고려한다면 이제 그런 불리한 상황이나 이런 부분이 어느 정도 조정이 될 수 있을 것 같고요. 그렇지만 그럼에도 불구하고 우리나라 그 산업계는 특히 설강 산업 같은 경우에는 탈탄소 공정을 개발한다던가 이 공정 개선에 있어서 지금 부단히 노력 중에 있습니다. 그래서 이런 부분에 있어서는 좀 개선할 수 있지 않을까 그렇게 생각을 하고요. 탄소 국경 조정 제도 이 시행에 대응하기 위해서 아까 그 발표 자료에도 나왔지만 여러 가지 국제적인 협력 체제가 있습니다. 이 다양한 협력 체제 중에서 우리나라가 현재 참여하고 있는 그리고 관심을 보이고 있는 협력 체제인 G7의 기후 클럽과 그리고 WTO의 무역과 지속 가능 환경 협의체 TESD라고 줄여 부르는데 이 두 가지 협의체에서 논의되고 있는 그 사항들을 좀 간단하게 사항에 대해서 간단하게 의견을 드리고자 합니다. 기후 클럽은 아까도 말씀하셨지만 미스터 우들랜드가 말씀하셨지만 2022년 1월 다보스 포럼에서 독일이 공식적으로 제안한 클럽이 되겠습니다. 이 기후 클럽은 EU의 CBAM의 이행에 어떻게 대응할 것인지 좀 같은 입장, 같은 의견을 가진 국가들끼리 같이 공동으로 대응하자라고 해서 만든 통상 정책 조율 협의체이고요. 최근에 그 통상 환경 변화가 경제 블록화라던가 유사 입장국, like-minded countries의 협력 강화라는 그런 추세를 반영하는 협의체라고 할 수 있습니다. 그런데 이런 CBAM에 효과적으로 대응할 수는 있지만 또 한편으로는 WTO 협정에 위배되지는 않는지 이런 부분들을 좀 더 검토해봐야 되는데요. 특히 이 클럽에 해당하는 국가들 간의 어떤 좀 특혜적인 그런 통상 조치가 취해진다면 WTO의 최애국 대우 원칙이라던가 이런 부분들에 대해서 위배될 수 있기 때문에 이런 여부를 좀 유의해서 접근해야 된다라고 봅니다. 그리고 WTO의 TESD 무역과 지속 가능 환경 협의체 같은 경우에는 그 WTO 설립 협정의 목적인 환경 보호에 기여하는 국제 통상 체제에 기여하기 위해서 그 WTO 내에서 무역과 환경 논의를 좀 활발하게 하기 위해서 2020년 말에 설립되었고요. 우리나라도 이 TESD 협의체에 참여해서 우리나라 정부도 이 논의에 참여하고 있습니다. 현재 이 TESD 안에서 4개의 작업반이 운영되고 있는데요. 하나는 무역 관련 기후 조치고요. 그리고 또 하나는 환경 상품과 서비스의 자유화가 되겠습니다. 그리고 또 세 번째는 순환경제, 네 번째는 보조금과 관련된 이렇게 4개의 작업반이 운영되고 있는데 오늘 그 주제였던 탄소 노출이나 CBAM 같은 경우에는 첫 번째 작업반인 무역 관련 기후 조치 작업반에서 지금 그 논의가 활발히 진행되고 있습니다. 그런데 이 CBAM의 이슈로 들어오면 선진국과 개도국이 굉장히 좀 의견이 다릅니다. 그 확연한 입장차가 존재하는데요. 개도국 입장에서는 이 CBAM 같은 제도가 일방적인 차별적 조치다라는 그 주장을 하고 있고요. 그리고 일단 WTO 협정에 위배될 가능성이 크다. 그리고 아까도 잠깐 언급하셨지만 UN 기후변화 협약인 UNFCCC의 CBDR Common but Differentiated Responsibilities 이 원칙에도 위배될 수 있다라는 그런 입장입니다. 그렇기 때문에 이 탄소 국경 조정과 같은 무역 관련 기후 조치를 시행한다고 하는 경우에 이 조치가 또 다른 국가 간의 차별을 초래하지 않아야 하겠고요. 그리고 이 각국의 탄소 가격 메커니즘이라던가 이런 기후 관련된 정책들을 비교할 수 있는 비교 가능하도록 정량화할 수 있는 방법론을 개발할 필요가 있다라고 봅니다. 그리고 또 한편으로는 아무래도 개발도상국 내에서는 이러한 무역 조치가 발효되는 경우에 이 자국 내에 이런 조치들에 대응할 수 있는 시스템을 개발하는 데에도 아무래도 아직은 역량이라던가 재원이 좀 부족할 수 있는데 이런 부분들을 위해서 기술 이전이나 어떤 포용적인 무역 논의를 하는 것도 중요하다. 그래서 무역을 위한 원조인 Aid for Trade의 이러한 내용들을 좀 반영할 필요가 있다. 이런 내용들이 논의가 진행되고 있습니다. 저는 오늘 발표에 대해서는 여기까지 좀 의견을 드리고 싶고요. 그리고 제가 사실 준비한 그 질문은 영국은 EU 가입국이 지금 현재 아니기 때문에 EU가 최근 발표하고 있는 뭐 탄소 국경 조정 제도라던가 그리고 이에 따른 ETS 무상 할당의 점진적 폐지 그리고 또 뭐 공급망의 ETS 실사 제도와 같은 굉장히 그런 급진적인 제도들이 환경 제도들이 많이 나오고 있는데 영국의 입장은 무엇이고 그리고 EU의 이런 제도들과의 어떤 정책적인 일관성을 유지하기 위해서 어떤 조치들을 취하시고 있는지 이런 부분도 궁금했고요. 그런데 아까 약간 그런 답변이 대신 지금 답변을 하신 것 같고 그리고 사실 이 산업계 입장에서는 또 정부와는 다른 목소리를 내는 경우도 있더라고요. 그래서 EU 내에서도 EU가 이런 제도를 들고 나왔지만 EU 내 산업계에서 오히려 이 제도들을 반대하는 경우도 있습니다. 그래서 영국 산업계에서는 어떤 의견들을 주로 내고 있는지 이런 부분들을 좀 질문드리고 싶습니다.
예, 임소영 박사님 고맙습니다. 주로 이제 한국 산업, 주요 산업, 특히 철강과 화학을 포함한 주요 산업에 영향을 미칠 수 있는 그 유럽발 CBAM이라는 제도의 현재 진행 상황, 또 우리가 어떤 식으로 여기 대응할 필요가 있는지 개도국과의 어떤 잠재적인 갈등 문제 잘 설명을 해주셨습니다. So, Mr. Woodland, there was a question for you. Because since UK is not part of EU at this moment, what are the discussions going around in your country in regard to the CBAM and other policies that are going on in EU?
Thank you for the question. Going back to the kind of one of the messages from my presentation, the UK is still very much at a decision stage in regard to its own CBAM. That is kind of the first thing to say. We realise we're committed to an international solution, which takes into account a number of equities, where there's a recognition of issues with regard to trade and how that links with this kind of climate progressive agenda. There's a whole matrix of issues in this space which are being considered before we decide on our own CBAM. In regard to the EU CBAM, again, this is one we're exploring the impact of the EU CBAM for UK businesses. I think we expect that ultimately with our ambitious carbon pricing, that the EU CBAM will take much into account for this, but there will be transactional compliance costs with all of this, and we're in a position of needing to support British industry through that. Now, I can't speak for the entirety of British industry and their view on CBAMs, but I think there is a broad recognition that in the path to taking the action required to decarbonise in line with UK targets, there is a risk of penalisation. If the UK and UK companies go faster than other companies, there's a risk of firstly potentially UK companies offshoring to countries where there are fewer regulation costs. That obviously doesn't help meet climate targets. But there's also a risk potentially that buyers will look overseas for Asian steel as opposed to British steel. If Asian countries or other providers of products have fewer costs. So there's a whole matrix of issues in this. The UK has net zero legislated. We have some of the toughest scrutiny processes in the world. In recent months, our Environmental Audit Committee has brought together both our Finance Ministry and our Business Ministry to exactly explore the question of what the risk is of carbon leakage, the impact of the EU CBAM. We are held over by democratic processes, and rigorous scrutiny to ensure that, firstly, we're achieving both our international commitments to net zero, our legislated commitments to net zero, whilst at the same time pulling in the direction of net zero, whilst committing to action which mitigates the climate crisis. There are a range of constituencies in this. There is no doubt that there are the stakeholders from overseas who we're absolutely consulting, but there are also a vocal range of constituencies within the UK who might also push us towards an action where, on CBAMs, where we see it in the interests of British industry. The sectors involved in this are so diverse, so I think there'll be a range of voices in this and a range of different decisions. But our starting point in all of this is we are in a process of consultation. We want to take opinions on. There are discussions going on between governments. But this is the first time this type of process has ever happened. There are learning curves. There's a need to take on feedback, and it's a really complicated mix of issues. And that's why we're committed to talking to our closest partners, including Korea, on what the best way forward is. Thank you.
네, 그러면 이제 세 번째 토론자로 환경부를 대표해서 박지영 사무관님 모셨습니다. 예, 10분간 말씀해 주시죠.
네, 안녕하세요. 환경부 박지영입니다. 오늘 탄소 중립을 위한 다양한 정책 수단이나 뭐 방안들에 대해서 기업들의 참여 방안이나 이런 발표를 되게 잘 들었습니다. 근데 그런 과정에서 저희는 이제 한국에서는 또 작년에 NDC 상향이라던가 탄소 중립을 위해서 저희가 다 같이 이제 움직여야 하는 과정에서 한국 정책적으로는 지금 배출권 거래제가 그 탄소 중립 달성을 위한 가장 중요한 제도적 수단이라고 생각을 합니다. 배출권 아까 EU의 ETS에 대해서 이제 설명도 해주시고 저희한테 이제 한국 ETS를 어떻게 개선시켜 나갔으면 좋겠는지 정책적 제안을 해주셨는데 관련해서 이제 한국 ETS 제도가 좀 어떻게 운영을 되어 왔는지를 말씀을 드리고 그리고 이제 말씀해주신 정책 제안과 연결을 해서 저희가 한국 ETS를 어떻게 가져가는 계획을 갖고 있는지 좀 같이 말씀을 드리고자 합니다. 한국에는 2015년에 배출권 거래제를 도입을 해서 15년부터 17년까지 1기, 그리고 18년부터 20년까지 2기, 그리고 21년 작년부터 제3차 계획기간을 앞으로 5년 동안 운영을 하게 될 계획입니다. 지금 현재 3차 계획기간 이행 연도 중에 있고요. 한국 배출권 거래제가 가지는 ETS랑 좀 다른 특징 중에 하나가 한국의 배출권 거래제는 6대 온실가스를 포함하고 있다는 부분입니다. EU ETS가 3대 온실가스를 포함하고 있는 거에 비해서 조금 더 포괄적으로 포괄을 하고 있고요. 그리고 또 가장 중요한 특징이 EU ETS는 직접 배출만을 대상으로 하고 있는 것과 달리 한국 배출권 거래제는 간접 배출을 포함을 하고 있습니다. 에너지 산업 부분이나 이제 비발전 부분에서의 에너지 수요 관리를 목적으로 간접 배출을 포함을 해서 운영을 하게 됐고요. 그리고 배출권 거래제는 지금 이제 기본적으로는 좀 다배출 업종을 대상으로 하고 있기 때문에 온실가스를 연간 12만 5천 톤 이상을 배출하는 업체이거나 아니면 2만 5천 톤 이상을 배출하는 사업장을 하나라도 가지고 있으면 ETS의 적용 대상이 되게 됩니다. 이렇게 적용 대상이 된 업체가 지금 현재는 3기가 시작을 할 때 약 684개 업체가 국내에서는 배출권 거래제 적용을 받고 있습니다. 이 부분은 이제 보통 저희가 이제 ETS는 캡앤트레이드 방식이기 때문에 배출 허용 총량을 어느 정도 정하는지가 사실 제도를 운영하는 데 있어서 제일 중요한 부분인데 배출 허용 총량은 기본적으로는 연도별 국가 온실가스 감축 목표를 바탕으로 설정을 하게 되고요. 한국 ETS가 또 가지고 있는 좀 중요한 특징 중에 하나가 이렇게 온실가스 좀 6개 부문을 기준으로 했을 때 저희는 커버리지가 배출량을 기준으로 70% 이상의 그 배출량을 커버를 하고 있습니다. 그래서 아까 말씀드렸던 것처럼 배출권 거래제가 한국의 탄소 중립을 위해서는 굉장히 중요한 정책적 수단이라는 의미를 지닙니다. 그리고 배출권을 할당하는 방식은 보통 과거 배출 실적을 보는 GF 방식과 배출 효율 기준을 보는 이제 BM 방식으로 보통 배출권을 할당하게 되는데요. 한국에서는 이 배출 효율을 기준으로 하는 할당 방식이 약 66% 3기부터는 그 정도 적용이 되어 오고 있습니다. 그리고 이제 EU에서도 CBAM 도입을 이제 CBAM을 도입을 하는 걸 준비를 하고 있지만 CBAM이 카본 리키지를 막기 위한 이런 고려의 방안으로서 도입이 된 것처럼 EU ETS에서도 이런 부분을 고려를 해서 카본 리키지 위험을 수준을 고려를 해서 무상할당 적용 대상을 이제 선정을 하고 있는데요. 한국에서도 마찬가지로 뭐 탄소 노출이라던가 경쟁력, 산업 경쟁력 이런 부분을 고려를 해서 무상할당 대상을 적용을 하고 있고요. 100% 무상할당을 받는 업체가 아닌 경우에는 10%의 유상할당을 받습니다. 이 부분이 이제 또 EU ETS와의 큰 차이점입니다. EU ETS에서는 발전 부분이 100%, 산업 부분이 약 70%의 유상할당을 적용받고 있는 것으로 알고 있는데 저희는 그 부분에 비하면 한국은 조금 낮은 수준입니다. 그리고 배출권 거래제 한 이제 7년 정도 배출권 거래제를 운영을 하면서 그래도 배출권 거래제가 18년 이후로는 배출량이 조금씩 감소를 해서 국가 감축 목표에 좀 기여를 한 부분이 있고, 그리고 이제 배출 효율 기준으로 할당을 받은 업체들을 저희가 살펴봤을 때 그 배출 원단위, 배출 효율이 조금 더 개선되는 효과가 있다라고 저희는 좀 보고 있고요. 그리고 그런데 이제 말씀하셨던 것처럼 탄소 중립도 달성을 해야 하고, 그리고 배출권 거래제가 이렇게 다양하게 운영을 안정적으로 이제 많이 운영이 되어 왔음에도 불구하고 또 좀 더 탄소 중립에 박차를 가하기 위해서는 배출권 거래제 개선이 좀 필요하다라고 저희가 생각을 하고 있습니다. 아무래도 아까 말씀드렸던 것처럼 유상할당 비율이 조금 낮은 편이기 때문에 기업의 감축 투자 유인 효과가 좀 제한적인 부분이 있고요. 그리고 기업들이 감축을 많이 하는 기업일수록 배출권 부분에서도 조금 인센티브를 받아가게 하려면 배출 효율을 기준으로 한 할당 방식이 좀 확대를 돼야 된다라고 생각을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 이런 부분에 있어서도 좀 검토를 할 계획입니다. 그리고 이제 아까 정책 제언해 주신 부분 중에서 또 배출권 거래 시장의 유동성이라든지 안정적인 운영에 대해서도 말씀을 해 주셨는데, 그래도 이제 배출권 시장이 한국 같은 경우에는 상대적으로 684개다 보니까 배출량은 많이 커버를 하고 있지만 업체 수가 상대적으로 좀 적은 부분이 있습니다. 그래서 그 이제 15년의 제도를 운행한 이후로 배출권 시장이 거래량이라던가는 10배 가까이 증가를 해오기는 했는데 아직까지는 조금 거래 시장에 할당 대상 업체 외에 시장 조성자라고 하는 그 유동성을 관리하는 그 제도와 또 증권사가 좀 제한적으로만 참여를 하고 있기 때문에 향후에 이런 부분에 대해서도 좀 저희가 좀 제도 개선을 고민을 하고 있습니다. 그리고 유상할당 또 좀 저희가 가져가고자 하는 방향은 배출권 거래제에 있어서는 할당 방식을 좀 선진화하고 또 시장 활성화를 위한 제도 개선을 집중적으로 추진을 하면서 또 그것과 더불어서 유상할당 수입을 아까 이제 EU의 제도에 대해서도 펀드 조성을 말씀을 하셨는데 그런 것처럼 저희도 이런 유상할당 재원을 수입을 다시 기업들의 감축 활동에다가 지원을 하고 R&D에 투자를 하고 이런 또 선순환 체계를 구축하는 것을 목표로 하고 있습니다. 배출권 거래제 관련해서 이제 한국의 제도 운영 방향이나 이런 부분과 관련해서 또 제가 발표를 들으면서 이제 발표자분들께 몇 가지 질문을 드리고 싶은 부분이 있었는데요. 이제 그 ETS 관련해서 이제 아까 저희가 말씀드렸던 것처럼 제도를 개선하는 걸 가져가려고 하면 이제 저희가 뭐 산업계라든가 아니면 이해관계자라든가 다양한 토론을 거쳐가면서 이제 저희 제도를 더 견고하게 만들어야 하는데 이제 아까 EU ETS는 그 과정에서 이제 좀 사회적 합의를 얻는 부분에 대해서 어떤 과정을 좀 거쳤는지 그런 부분도 좀 궁금하고, 그리고 또 제언을 해주신 부분도 그렇고 EU ETS가 고민을 하고 있는 부분에서 이 건물 수송 부분에 대한 New ETS 적용을 이제 고민을 하고 있다라고 알고 있습니다. 말씀도 해주셨고요. 이 부분 역시 EU ETS에서도 되게 사회적인 영향력이 클 거라고 생각을 하는데 적용을 했을 때 사회적 이제 아까 말씀드렸던 것 같은 맥락에서 사회적 합의나 제도를 설계하는 과정에서 어떤 이제 그 생각을 가지고 계신지 또 어떻게 가져가게 될 것인지 좀 의견을 듣고 싶습니다. 그리고 정보 공시하고 관련을 해서요. 배출량 같은 경우는 이제 예를 들면 지금 말씀하신 시밤과도 연계를 해서 그러니까 기업의 정보 공시뿐만이 아니라 그냥 시밤과도 연계를 해서 각각의 배출량, 예를 들면 온실가스 배출량을 어떻게 측정을 하고 또 어떻게 이 부분을 상호 인증을 할 것인지 국가 간의 차이가 있기 때문에 이런 부분을 좀 명확하게 하는 부분이 되게 중요한 역할을 해야 될 거라고 생각을 하는데 아까 이제 정보 공시 때 말씀을 해주셨던 것처럼 뭐 영역이나 국가 간에도 아니면 또 이 제도를 적용을 하는 기관 간에도 이 환경 정보에 대한 인식 차이가 좀 있다고 알고 있습니다. 그래서 혹시 그런 환경 측정 기준에 대한 뭐 통일이나 조정 이런 부분에 대한 이제 움직임이 있는지, 그리고 이런 부분을 좀 해결하기 위한 의견이나 제언 같은 게 있으신지 좀 궁금합니다.
네, 박지영 사무관님이 아마 KETS, 그러니까 한국의 ETS 제도에 대해서 익숙하지 않은 분들은 박지영 사무관님 설명을 통해서 많은 부분이 이해가 됐을 것이라고 생각을 합니다. So again, we have two questions. I think the first one is for Mr. Ritchie. Can you answer that?
Thank you very much for your contributions and questions. In terms of they're great questions, and in terms of the process for the EU adopted to create social consensus amongst relevant stakeholders. So I guess the key decisions for the ETS is the level of the cap, the level of the benchmark, the choice of carbon leakage factor, things like that. So the level of the cap was determined by modelling of cost-effective compliance between ETS and non-ETS sectors. So they use the PRIMES model, energy system model, and each member state has access to the input data for that model so they can see the assumptions that the modelers use. There's some transparency. It's a bit of a black box, but there's some transparency about the data and stakeholder discussion of the results. And the 61% reduction target was subject to stakeholder engagement and discussion. They have 12-week stakeholder consultation period. This is more a question between the burden that the ETS takes versus non-ETS. So I think that they have best practice in stakeholder engagement, and I guess the issue is really what's at stake for industry. So the EU industry perhaps accepted the policy because they know and they're committed to the Fit for 55 EU targets, and that the methodology is exactly the same as they used before. When they came up with 43% for ETS before, it's exactly the same methodology. So the EU decides its criteria for decision-making based on equal cost effectiveness. Korea makes its decisions in a slightly different way. But I think it's about open engagement and discussion, but it's also about understanding the concerns of industry and the affected stakeholders. So EU industry are concerned about carbon leakage. So the CBAM is to give them some assurance that the imported products will be treated the same way as a product made in the EU. So that helped them to accept more ambitious targets. And they also like the idea of the innovation fund that gives them a lot of money to support low carbon investment. They like the idea of auction revenue recycling. So I think it's about understanding the competitiveness concerns of industry and working with that and developing a policy that does not discriminate or cause competitive disadvantage for best performers in the sector. So I think the ETS for buildings and transport, I mentioned that there's a social climate fund. So 25% of this is entirely auction because there's no buildings and transport pass through all their costs. There's no carbon leakage for building sector. So 25% of the auction revenue goes to this fund that can be used to support disadvantaged households and I think in terms of the question about CBAM, maybe Jonathan will add to that, but the measurement of embedded emissions in products is subject to detailed legal instruments that are being developed at this moment. So this is still, the detailed implementation measures of CBAM are still work in progress, but they will be applied consistently across every country. But I do think that the EU is best practice in stakeholder engagement, and there's some really good, considering how difficult it is in the EU to agree any policy when you've got vast differences in wealth between member states, huge differences in interests. It's incredible, really, and I think it's definitely, I mean, California is another good practice. I think California is really good at working with stakeholders and getting agreement and working with very antagonistic and aggressive stakeholders. And ultimately, people begin to realize that we need to do something about climate change. And industry, whilst in California, we're fighting against the cap and trade program, fighting against low carbon fuel standards. They can see the droughts, the wildfires. In Seoul, you can see the floods. So I think industry begins to realize it's in their own interest to be ambitious. So that's it.
So a short follow-up question. Are there any complaints or even resistance from the industrial sector in Europe when you try to expedite the EU ETS or CBAM? Because it'll be a burden, to the industrial sector, because that's what's happening in Korea. But our industrial sector is always complaining that when government tries to tighten the KETS or other regulatory measures, you're trying to kill us. That's the responses from the industrial sector. In the past, more, still somewhat.
I think the EU industry are concerned about the CBAM because it doesn't protect their exports outside the EU. So the steel industry in Germany exporting steel to outside the EU is not protected by CBAM. So they're concerned about that. They're concerned about the MRV burden. The chemicals industry are concerned about CBAM applying to them. But there's definitely, I think one of the issues with the CBAM is the MRV burden, the challenge of working out embedded emissions in your product. But I think from Korea's point of view, in terms of CBAM, once the KHS cap is aligned with the 2030 NDC, Korea's challenges will be different. It will no longer be, how do we get to the EU carbon price? It will be the carbon leakage risk from Korea to other countries that have less ambitious climate policy. So Korea might need to consider its own CBAM. What is the carbon leakage mitigation measure in Korea going to be once Korea adopts this 2030 NDC and the carbon price jumps up, doubles or triples? But I think the other thing to really be aware of is this dynamic area. India, a few days ago, has adopted legislation for a carbon market. Indonesia will have one by 2025. China will expand its ETS to cement, aluminium, and steel in the next few years. So the competitive dynamics is very changing. But ultimately, it requires not just looking about the punitive effect of the EU, but looking at how is Korea industry going to be protected by meeting the 2030 NDC.
Thank you. Mr. Watson?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So, how to approach disclosure and consistency? I guess I'm optimistic, to be honest. The collection and collation of past systems, programs and focuses haven't intended to be disparate or different. They've evolved out of different drivers and different requirements. What we've seen, I think, in the recent past is, and I guess I used the word evolution, and evolution builds on what's gone before to make something better. So I'm quite confident that Korea will be able to build on the best of what's out there. I think there's very strong recognition on the value of consistent terminology, accepting the best methodologies, and building on those into a Korean framework. And I think that will give us sufficient consistency. The key to it, and it was mentioned probably just a couple of times already, is the consultation aspect. So any guidelines need to be socialised, I guess, with industry, with government, and with players outside of Korea who have an influence and interest in Korea. I note that the recent 3 documentation that I spoke about earlier, I mean, the standards received comments from 6 different continents. So there's, as I say, I'm optimistic that we can move forward by building on the best and by then consulting before we finalise.
예, 땡큐. 박지영 사무관님이 정부 대표에서 오셨으니까 제가 질문 하나 드리고 싶은데요. 아까 그 리치 소장께서 발표할 때 유럽에서는 카본 컨트랙트 포 디퍼런스, 이 우리말로 번역을 어떻게 해야 약간 탄소 가격, 탄소 차이, 예, 번역이 좀 어색한데 그 카본 컨트랙트 포 디퍼런스 얘기를 하면서 이런 게 이제 어떤 기업의 불확실성을 좀 줄이고 투자를 더 늘릴 수 있다, 이제 이런 그 정부에서는 이런 식의, 특히 이제 우리 스틸 인더스트리, 그러니까 이 철강 산업 같은 경우에는 뭐 수소환원 제철이 있긴 하지만 워낙에 비용이 많이 들어가서 투자도 굉장히 어렵다, 이런 얘기를 많이 하는데 이런 조금 좀 새롭고 혁신적인 제도, 정부의 좀 지원이 필요한 이런 거에 대한 검토는 좀 하고 있나요? 하고 있으시겠죠?
안 그래도 아까 이제 말씀드렸던 부분 중에 저희가 그 지원 사업을 좀 확대를 할 거다 이런 말씀을 드렸는데, 이제 그 부분에서는 이제 지원 사업의 뭐 쉽게 말하면 지원 액수만을 뿐만이 아니라 저희가 안 그래도 이제 말씀하신 것처럼 저희는 이걸 이제 탄소 차액 계약 제도 이렇게 번역을 했는데요. 이 제도를 뭐 도입한다 이거는 아니어도 저희가 좀 현재 지원 사업을 좀 더 다변화시킬 수 있는 뭐 기술에 좀 더 기술 개발에 좀 더 투자를 하고, 좀 더 현실성 있고 효과가 있는 이제 감축 사업을 좀 더 도입할 수 있게끔 그런 지원 사업을 확대하기 위한 방안을 지금 저희가 고민을 많이 하고 있습니다. 그래서 좀 그런 부분을 마련을 하려고 준비 중에 있습니다.
예, 고맙습니다. 예, 사실 그 주최 측에서는 이 뒤에 다른 또 세션이 없으니 계속해도 된다고 저한테 연락을 주셨는데, 사실 그렇게 2시간 이상을 했고, 그래서 집중력도 떨어지고, 제가 보기에는 중요한 이슈들은 다 대부분 다 발표와 토론을 통해서 다루어졌다고 생각을 합니다. 그래서 오늘 유럽과 또 영국의 또 미국의 이런 각종 이 기후 위기에 대응하기 위한 제도들, 또 공시제도에 대한 설명을 들었고, 또 이것이 우리나라에 주는 영향, 또 한국 정부는 어떻게 대응하고 있고 한국 산업계는 어떤 대응이 필요할지에 대한 많은 이야기를 나눴다고 생각합니다. 앞으로 저도 뭐 학계에 있지만 정말 총력전을 기울여야 하지 않나 싶어요. 한국으로서는 이 금융 부분의 역할도 굉장히 중요하고, 그래서 그런 것들이 오늘 또 토론을 계기로 좀 더 실질적인 변화가 일어날 수 있기를 기대하는 마음입니다. 잠깐만요, 또 뭐. 예, 그러면 세션을 이것으로 종료하도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Hong Jong-ho, and please give it up for our 6 panelists for their active participation and a fruitful discussion. And that concludes the 13th International Greenhouse Gas Conference. On behalf of the Korean Ministry of Environment, once again, I would like to extend our sincerest gratitude to each and everyone for your participation until the very end. Now, for our on-site participants, we have prepared a small souvenir, a small gift for you. So as you exit this grand ballroom and return your interpretation devices, our staff members will exchange it for the said gift. So please don't forget to collect one on your way out. Other than that, please have a safe journey back home, and we do wish to see you again in the next iteration of the International Greenhouse Gas Conference. 조심히 돌아가십시오. 고맙습니다.